feeling terrible, you don't know why you're feeling terrible, and you're certainly not telling anybody about it. You're going through the motions, and we hear about this all the time. But now I realize that talking about it, and I find out that there's other people that feel the same way.
Awekenge, this is Mental Mythos, hosted by Asekho. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mental Mythos. I'm your host, Asekho. And before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation.
Hello.
Firstly, just I wrote so many things in terms of I really, as much as I actually do research, but I think I went too far in terms of researching because I have four I think I four or five different types of, I would say, codes. But firstly, before we get into the other things, I would like to just explore your journey of facing grief and how it actually felt, the all the emotions that you came across.
Yeah. Yeah. So the grief was overwhelming. Overwhelming. The process is overwhelming because there are so many heavy emotions, and there really is no end to the range of emotion that you feel when you have a significant loss. And and I think that for people is the hardest part, is that these overwhelming emotions come up, and then what do we do with them is the key. And lots of times we don't want to feel those really big, heavy emotions like anger,
Mm.
frustration, guilt, sadness, all of those things. And so we suppress them. And that's where the the grief, it's trying to help us, but we are pushing it away.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that's the first thing I learned when I went to see my grief coach. And that's the first thing I tell everybody, is that we don't want to suppress those emotions. We want to actually feel those emotions, and we want to let them release.
It goes back to, like, I saw a video on Instagram whereas it really entailed the conversation on grief, as you've said, that the more grief comes to us, pressing towards us, we press against it, whereas we don't realize that through experiencing this grief, we will, in terms of, we never know that we'll find joy beyond the grief, realizing that, having that acceptance of, yeah, this person is gone and I just have to live. And one thing that I've realized doing my research in terms of finding more ways to grieve, in terms of how to cope actually initially with grief, is the fact that grief never stops. Grief stops when the love stops, in terms of that. One thing that I've seen, one thing that I've learned, that through all this. And definitely grief changes a person in a way, and you don't remain the person that you were. So how did grief change you when you lost your husband?
Yeah, well, it first of all, I didn't know who I was. because you identify yourself with that person that you lost. And so I was always Blaine's wife. And so when I'm not Blaine's wife, who am I? And that was the big question. And I also retired from my job. I was a school principal at that time. And so if I'm not a school principal, who am I? And so it's going back to yourself and rediscovering who you are without that person. And it's a really interesting journey because we often get caught up in life. We're told, to get a good job, you're gonna marry your loved one, you're gonna have a family, and everything's gonna be great, right? Um, and we identify ourselves with those things, and we measure ourselves by the success that we have with those kinds of things. But when you are stripped from that, you're forced to look at who you are without all of that.
Mm.
And that's how grief changed me.
And I believe that no no one prepares us for how to deal with grief. No one prepares us. If this, as much as there are things that people teach us in terms of how to take care of your money, how to budget, how to be successful, how to be a good father, how to be a good mother, how to be a good son, how to be a good daughter. But something that we don't be taught has we don't we are not taught enough is how to deal with grief, how to expect grief, and death happens to us all. Eventually, at some point in our lives, we will die and leave this world. And uh, following with this quote, as I mentioned, that I just I written some few quotes. Uh, this guy, I forgot his name. Also, has a podcast. He's a psychotherapist where he said that the heaviest part of grief is losing the ability to make things right with them. And that really hit home in a way because on my, I would say, experience or my, yes, let me put it that way, experience was that when I lost my grandmother, I had this blame game in terms of blaming myself, that not telling her how not telling her enough that how much I loved her, and things that really came within my mind, not realizing that these things happen in life. And it goes back to that thing of telling your loved ones that you love them. It's something that I feel like in terms of this conversation, I hope that the audience, who people that are listening to, will be listening to this podcast, is the fact that don't forget to love your loved ones, because you never know when they will be taken away from you. It's something that I realized that it is quite important. And in terms of that, what was the heaviest part of your grief?
Yeah, well, certainly what you're talking about there is kind of like a guilt. And grief gives us, there's a couple of things. It gives us a gift, and you're expressing the gift right there, is that understanding that life is short and that we need to do what we need to do when we need to do it, and that we shouldn't put it off.
Mm.
Also, the other part of that is that um, we can feel a lot of guilt for maybe not spending enough time with them. Um, for myself, there was some guilt with not being able to do more to save him. Like maybe if I'd have done this, or maybe if I'd have done that, he would have lived. But the definition of guilt is really doing something to harm someone else on purpose.
Mm.
It's like, and so if you think about that, there was never any harm meant to be done. And so we really just need to let that go. Guilt is very, very low on that frequency list. There's a list of vibrations. And grief is really, really heavy. It's really heavy. And as long as we stay, or guilt, as long as we stay in guilt, we're going to be in a really dark place. And so we really want to let that go. And so if you are in that space, it's good to get somebody to help you walk through that, because it's really our thoughts that are making us feel guilty about what happened. And yeah, that was a big one for me, for sure.
Yeah.
And it for a lot of people. Yeah.
It really, in terms of, it really puts you in that dark place. And I feel like the effects of grief, I would say, to me, they just appeared this year because, as I mentioned, that I lost my grandmother, stepfather, and uncle. And at that time around, I didn't think about it because, in a way, I feel like I was young to process all those things. And that sense, I had that sense of the responsibility of not of just being for people out there, for being there for my family in a way. So it really was difficult when I actually faced it this year, and when I first had my guest in terms of speaking about grief and how does it take an impact on one's mental well-being. As much as I was doing that episode, I feel like at the same time I was venting in a way of realizing that I have this pain that is within me and I haven't really healed from it, or I haven't looked upon it. And looking back now, there's this thing in psychotherapy, in psychotherapy, which psychoanalysis, whereas it's repression. And I feel like, in a way, my brain really protected me in a way by pushing my grief from conscious to sub unconscious, because now it appears in a way of realizing that I'm facing grief. What steps should I take? What should I do? Do I seek help, or do I just let it flow, let it burst out? And that's one thing that I love about psychoanalysis. It really touches on the brain, and there's this thing called super ego, whereas it differentiates from good or bad, from negative to positive in terms of that. Now, and I'm able to invite people like you, people that have suffered grief, people that have experience in terms of grief, and whereas I will learn something new in see a different perspective, and not only me but also the audience. So in this, I would say, in a journey of grief, at what point that you decided that you need to work on yourself, you need to take care of yourself? As people that are suffering, you don't usually look after yourself. You are in that limbo, I would say limbo, in that moment of think about the lost one that you lost, your lost one, and realize that you're still in the state of crying, of weeping, of not doing anything, just thinking about them. What was your turning point?
Yeah, well, that was pretty much it. So when you get to that space where you are feeling all of those emotions and you're kind of going through the motions of your day, you're maybe getting up and having a shower and having something to eat or not. And you're going through those motions, and there's this cloud of sadness that is hovering over everything that you do. Everything that should be joyful has this cloud of sadness to it. And after a certain amount of time, and for me, it was about 2 months, I realized that it wasn't getting better, that I didn't know how to do this. I thought I could do it by myself. Everybody says that,
Mm,
time heals all wounds, right? They tell you that. Um, but but I realized it just wasn't happening. And I was looking for hope. Looking for hope that I would feel better someday. And I was lucky enough to come across some information quote and an article that kind of led me down this path to find a grief coach and work with her. And I will say that when I signed up to do the discovery call, I was scared. I was scared to have to talk to her about all my emotions and all the things that were happening with me. But I also knew that if I didn't, things weren't going to get better. That I really didn't know how to handle it. I didn't. And one session with her made a huge difference. And so I'm so glad that I did.
Mm, mm, mm. It's something that I believe that we are run away from in terms of speaking our emotions, speaking about, especially for grief. It is something that people see as not something to talk about, because it will bring those whole emotions back of not able to handle them as much as you've had this path of healing, and all of a sudden you want to talk about this, and people have as I'm saying, this perception of, no, I will go back to that feeling that I was in, and I will spend another 6 months of trying to heal from the same thing that I was avoiding in terms of that. And it really hits home and something that really sparked me in a video that I came across, is that thing of where this lady says that when you sit at the front of the funeral, it seems different because you have a different perspective compared to a person that is sitting behind, because they don't actually, as much as they may say that they might be a little bit affected by the death, but not compared to the person that's sitting in the front, because they really feel the pain of losing someone that really meant everything to them, meant the world to them. As you've said, that you didn't actually know your identity, you didn't realize who you are, you didn't see the point of who you are. And some people, I feel like, in a way, I would say they run out. Their escape is it's either addiction, or they tend to go to, in terms of finding a solution of suicide, because the people they love, they are no longer in this life. And more, and I find that a very, I would say, other people might say that it's quite selfish, but sometimes what might kill you might not kill me, but what might kill me might not kill you. And I really try by any means to emphasize that code, because it really hits home when it comes to grief, because grief is something that we need to, I would say, I wouldn't say normalize, but something that we need to start taking care of, something that we start needing to talk about, because in a way it really messes up with our relationships, it really messes up with how we feel about ourselves, how we as, for example, as I've said, that being able to be in this healing journey, and all of a sudden you hear this thing that your loved one has passed away. And I feel like on my on my own personal journey, I have seen that I have dealt with that feeling of grief, of saying that I was in the dark place, whereas I didn't know how to get out of, in terms when it came to grief. And when I heard that my another grandmother passed away this year, I found myself revisiting that state and not knowing how to get out. But in a way, through doing this podcast, through inviting people, through talking about how I actually feel, it has really helped me in a way, and has in a way taken me a bit out of that dark place. So I just want you to explain to us, as you mentioned awaken your soul's journey. Can you tell us what is that about?
Yeah. So I really feel like when I was going through this process of grief, at the same time, I was searching for who I am. And in that search, you start to question why you're here. Why are you here? What is the purpose of life? What am I doing? And that leads you down this spiritual journey. And so I feel like grief is a pathway to transformation. It's a catalyst for a spiritual awakening. And if we can embrace it rather than push it away, it can help us open up to truer meaning in our life and purpose in our life. And so I think that's, the Awaken Your Soul's journey is about that process. It's about awakening to who you truly are and what your own truth is through that grieving process.
Mm, mm, mm. And instead of when someone really tells you in terms of spirituality, people are quite, in a way, skeptical in terms of that. And usually it's something that I myself have tried by any means to run away from it because it has a different perspective in terms of people of the places that I grew up in. And I feel like it's something that I would like you to help us in terms of awakening your journey. What kind of support or resources does the whole community offer to those who are grieving?
Yeah. So, as I said, you start to ask these questions and you start to figure out what your belief is. Now, everybody's belief is going to be slightly different. We've all been raised in different ways. But for me, I really believe in an afterlife. I believe that my husband is in a beautiful place right now. I feel like I have a connection with him and that I can talk to him and that he sends me signs and messages.
Mm.
And these things help me get closer to who I am as a person. I mean, one of the things I learned was that I can do summits. I can interview people like you are and learn more about grief. Where before my husband passed away, I would have never done that. I would have never considered holding a summit, interviewing people I don't know. But through this process, I started to discover that this is something that I enjoy. It's something that I seek out. And I feel like he's with me, helping me, guiding me, because he was that social butterfly. He loved to talk to people, right? And so I feel like there's that connection with him. And it continues in a variety of ways. And it continues to, it's like our relationship has changed.
Mm.
It's still, but it's different.
Mm.
Yeah.
In a way, would you say that it's quite stronger than before in terms of relationship, your relationship?
Yeah, in some ways, I think so. Yes. Yeah. Because it's not just a physical relationship. Now it's this spiritual relationship that I can really feel. And yes, I miss the physical relationship. I miss having him here in the room with me and being able to travel with him and do all those things. And yet, at the same time, I've been enriched by this relationship that we have now. And so it's this and that, both.
And I would like to agree with you when you said that you were not used to talking with strangers in terms of interviewing, holding summits. And I feel like sometimes when you have that purpose of just you want to address this message, this particular message, having to through having finding purpose, I would say that finding purpose within your pain and something that I have come across in terms of when it comes to grief, people really preach the thing of finding purpose within your pain and not having staying that in that moment of grief, of standing in a moment of sadness and just walk of sadness, in a moment of sadness, try realizing that I can do something better, something that will make them proud of me, something that do. And I feel like it really it really destroyed that feeling of guilt because you are doing this in their name. And it's something that I feel like as human beings we need to try by any means to tell ourselves that as much as I have this pain within me, let me try on doing something that will benefit other people, something that will make me happy, not only me, but also the person that I've lost. And at some point, I feel like through me, speaking of grief, I just think about the people that I've lost. And I realize that as much as I don't know, like every time I talk about a conversation around grief, I become more sadder, more and more and more. I don't get used to it. It's quite difficult to get used to it because I have that thing of I have those thoughts of going back to the thoughts that I really miss them. I really enjoy my time with them, and it really takes strength to talk about such issues, being that vulnerable about grief and being just finding that purpose, doing as you've mentioned, doing the interviews, doing the summits. It definitely at first you just shaking in terms of being in front of many people because it's something that I have went through when I started this podcast. I felt like an idiot when I started doing this because didn't have guests. It was me and the camera, the laptop, and talking on the mic. And it at first it became weird, and as years went by, I realized that I have a purpose of just talking about mental well-being. In terms of that, speaking about mental well-being, how has your mental health changed from that time that you lost your husband until now?
Yeah. Well, I didn't really understand mental health.
Mm.
Um, you know, it's another thing that we don't talk about. It's like you're feeling terrible. You don't know why you're feeling terrible, and you're certainly not telling anybody about it. You're going through the motions, and we hear about this all the time. Um, but now I realize that talking about it, and I find out that there's other people that feel the same way. That
Mhm.
it's not strange the way I am feeling, the emotions that I'm having, and just sharing my story with others has been cathartic. It's like it's a gift to share my story through my blog or through the podcast or what have you. Other people resonate with that, and and we walk with each other through this journey rather than walking it alone. It's too hard to do by yourself.
Mm, mm, mm. That's the thing. As people that as people we think that working alone this journey. At first, I don't know lie. At first, I thought that I'm gonna walk it alone and I am strong and I will survive it. But only to find out it takes time. It takes effort. It takes people. Because if you don't talk about it, you won't see what actually wrong with you. You won't see that you really need help, and you won't know what are the right resources to tackle this thing that you are facing. And working this journey has taught me so many things. It has taught me to be patient with people. It had taught me to be aware of my surrounding and not and overall to be kind to people. Being kind is something that I feel like one of the things that I have learned more and more. As much as I did have kindness before, but not the way I am now, because I am filled with kindness in a way of even if someone does something to me, I will forgive them in a way. I will talk to them with in a kind manner. And definitely I have my disruptions in terms when it comes to anger. But one thing that I never forget is the fact of being kind, of being able to considerate when it comes to other people. So looking back, going back to your past, looking back to now, what would you give what kind of advice would you give to your younger self in terms of compared to now when you faced that grief?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to tell her that to be herself, to find out who she is and not to live her life by what we believe is the secret of life, right? It's like what you inside of you, what lights you up. And I mean, for the most part, I did things that I enjoyed. I was an educator and I taught kids and I absolutely loved it. But there were a lot of things that I did to please other people.
Mm.
And and I think I would tell her, you know what, you have to make those decisions about what you're going to do for you and how you're going to look after you. And that it's not, you don't need to apologize for being you.
Mm. Mm, mm. Really, really crucial what you just said, that you mustn't apologize for being you. And sometimes we really run away from ourselves whenever that we have that spark of ourselves. We tend to hide it in a way because we are afraid of being judged by other people, of being having this positivity, having not going with the norms of the world or slash the society as a whole. So yeah, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing the story. Thank you so much for sharing the resources in terms of the perspective that you had when it comes to grief and how you have tackled it. And I believe that one of the most difficult things to deal with, as I kept on emphasizing on this particular episode, that grief is quite hard, and in a way, grief is forever. What this thing I believe that grief is forever because you keep on remembering those people, because that sense of love, that sense of realizing that you lost people that you loved. So with those words, I would like to say thank you so much for being here, for just sharing your story. It I really appreciate it. I don't know lie. I don't take it for granted. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you.